Section 1. It all started on a bright Saturday morning, the kind of day where the sun felt like a soft blanket instead of a blazing torch, and I was enjoying my coffee on the porch of my house that overlooked the quiet cul-de-sac where everything always seemed too perfect, too manicured, too controlled by the ever-watchful eyes of the Homeowners Association. I had moved into this neighborhood not because I liked rules, but because I liked peace, and ironically, peace was the very thing the HOA tried to strip away under the guise of community order. I had learned quickly that the so-called order was less about maintaining property values and more about feeding the egos of people like Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA board, a woman whose shrill voice could be heard before she turned the corner, whose blonde bob was always so stiff with hairspray it looked like a helmet, and whose constant smirk carried the smugness of someone who thought she owned every inch of the street. From the day I moved in, she had made it her mission to remind me of the rules, leaving passive-aggressive notes on my door about my grass length, the placement of my trash bins, even the color of my curtains, as if the shade of my living room drapes was somehow a threat to the sanctity of the neighborhood. At first, I tried to ignore her, assuming she was just another bored neighbor with too much time, but then she started escalating. She'd stand in front of my driveway, hands on hips, lecturing me about HOA guidelines like she was reading scripture, and she'd mutter about fines, violations, and how she'd have no choice but to report me to the board. The irony of it all, the part that made me smirk every time I watched her rant, was that she had no idea who really owned this house, or rather, who owned hers. You see, unlike most residents here, I wasn't just a homeowner, I was also a landlord. Over the years, I'd quietly invested in real estate, buying up properties in this very neighborhood, renting them out to families, couples, even Karen herself, though she didn't know it. She thought she was on top of the world, barking orders at me, trying to humiliate me in front of the neighbors, while all along she was paying me rent every month, her money flowing straight into my bank account like clockwork. That secret gave me patience, gave me a strange satisfaction as she puffed herself up with false power, but that patience wore thin the day she decided to call 911 on me. It started with something as petty as my truck. I had parked it in my driveway, loaded with tools and lumber for a small renovation project I was working on inside the house, and within an hour Karen was storming across the street, waving a clipboard and shouting about unauthorized construction and commercial vehicles in a residential zone. I told her calmly that it was my personal truck, that I was renovating my own kitchen, but she wasn't interested in logic. She wanted control, and when she realized I wasn't going to bow down to her fake authority, she did the unthinkable. She pulled out her phone, glared at me with those beady eyes, and called 911. "Yes, officer," I heard her say, voice dripping with false concern. "We have a dangerous situation here. A neighbor in violation of multiple HOA rules, possibly running illegal construction without permits, and he's becoming aggressive." Aggressive? I hadn't raised my voice once. I just stood there, sipping the last of my coffee, wondering how far this woman was willing to go just to feel powerful. Within 10 minutes, 2 squad cars rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing, and suddenly all the curtains in the cul-de-sac twitched as neighbors peeked out, hungry for drama. The officers stepped out, calm but cautious, and Karen immediately pounced on them, waving her arms like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of lies. She pointed at my truck, at me, at the stack of lumber in my driveway, spinning a tale about dangerous activity, possible code violations, and how she feared for community safety. I waited until she was finished, let her words hang in the air like smoke, and then I pulled out my own folder, the one I always kept handy, just in case Karen decided to play dirty. Inside were all the property records, not just for my house, but for several others on this street, including hers. When the officers finally turned to me, asking if I had a permit for construction, I smiled and said, "Gentlemen, I'm working on my own home, which requires no special permit for interior renovation. But before we go any further, I think you should know something about Ms. Karen here." I flipped open the folder, pulled out one neatly signed lease agreement, and handed it to the officer. His eyes scanned the paper, then flicked back up to Karen, who suddenly looked pale. "You see," I continued, my voice steady but loud enough for the nosy neighbors to hear, "while she's here trying to claim authority over me, she forgot to mention that she's not even a homeowner. She's my tenant. Every month she pays me rent. So, technically, gentlemen, she works for me more than I answer to her HOA fantasies. The silence that followed was delicious. Karen's jaw dropped. Her words tangled in her throat as the officer raised an eyebrow, holding up the lease as undeniable proof. The neighbor's curtains twitched harder. I could almost hear the gasps behind the glass as the queen of the HOA was dethroned in an instant. One officer cleared his throat and said, "Ma'am, is this true? You rent this property?" Karen stammered, tried to twist it, tried to deflect by pointing back at me, but the damage was done. The officers realized there was no crime here, no threat, just a bitter woman abusing 911 for personal vendettas, and they warned her sternly about filing false reports. She shrank back, her bravado gone, but I wasn't finished. I leaned closer, not threatening, just firm, and said, "Karen, the next time you want to waste police resources over HOA rules, remember whose name is on your rent check. You want to call the cops on me? You're calling them on your landlord." The look on her face was priceless, anger, humiliation, disbelief, all rolled into one. And though she stormed off without another word, I knew this was only the beginning. Because people like Karen don't quit after one defeat, they double down. And as I watched her retreat into the house that technically belonged to me, I could already see the wheels turning in her mind, plotting her next move, and I knew that the war between us had only just begun. Section 2, the days following the police incident were strangely quiet in the neighborhood, as if the entire cul-de-sac had been stunned into silence by the revelation that the self-proclaimed queen bee of the HOA, Karen, wasn't even a homeowner but merely a tenant living under the roof I owned, and though the neighbors tried to carry on with their usual routines, watering lawns at precisely 8 a.m., walking their dogs in perfectly measured laps around the block, trimming hedges into unnatural, geometric shapes, the undercurrent of gossip was undeniable. People spoke in hushed tones on sidewalks, their eyes flicking toward Karen's house whenever she wasn't looking, and the smug power she once wielded with a pointed finger and a clipboard seemed to dissolve in the summer heat. For a brief moment, I thought maybe she'd retreat, lick her wounds, and accept her place, but Karen wasn't built that way. Humiliation doesn't humble people like her, it fuels them, and the quiet was only the calm before the storm. On the third night, after the 911 stunt, I noticed her porch light flicker on around 10, and through the blinds I watched as a small group gathered at her front door, two other HOA board members, a stern man named George, who always wore sweater vests no matter the weather, and Linda, a retiree whose face seemed permanently pinched into disapproval. They carried folders, papers, and what looked like a large binder, and they disappeared inside Karen's house with the energy of conspirators plotting a coup. I chuckled to myself because I knew exactly what was happening. Karen had lost her public battle. So now she was trying to regroup behind closed doors, rallying her allies on the board to find a new way to bring me down. I could imagine her voice rising inside, shrill and indignant, painting herself as the victim, claiming I had disrespected her, the HOA, the very sanctity of the community, and I could picture George nodding solemnly, adjusting his glasses, while Linda scribbled furious notes about new enforcement measures. I decided not to worry. Let them plot, because what they didn't know was that every single move they could make was bound by contracts, by property records, by financial realities that always tilted in my favor. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew Karen's ego wouldn't let her stop at paperwork. The next morning, right on schedule, the first salvo came in the form of a letter slipped into my mailbox, printed on official HOA stationery. It accused me of multiple violations. Leaving a commercial vehicle in my driveway, the truck again, storing construction materials visible from the street, the lumber, and creating a disruptive atmosphere by involving law enforcement in neighborhood disputes. I laughed out loud reading that last one, because Karen had been the one to dial 911, yet here she was spinning the narrative like I had brought chaos to the block. The letter concluded with a warning that fines would begin accruing if I did not comply within 7 days. I set the letter down, poured myself another cup of coffee, and pulled out a different folder from my cabinet, this one containing not just lease agreements, but copies of HOA bylaws, state rental regulations, and even some legal opinions I had collected over the years. You see, I wasn't just a landlord for profit, I was a landlord who enjoyed being prepared, who understood that knowledge was the greatest defense against people like Karen. I knew, for example, that the HOA had no authority to fine me for personal vehicles in my own driveway, nor could they dictate temporary storage of construction materials for home improvement. Their power was limited, and their threats were mostly bluffs designed to scare homeowners into compliance. But here's where the delicious irony came in. Karen, being my tenant, wasn't even a homeowner, which meant she technically wasn't eligible to hold a board position in the HOA. I hadn't revealed that fact yet because I was waiting for the right moment, the perfect time to drop the bomb, but I kept the evidence close at hand. As I thought about how to handle the new letter, I decided it was better not to strike immediately. Let Karen dig her hole deeper. Let her build her case with fake violations and exaggerated claims so that when the truth came out, her entire crusade would collapse like a house of cards. Over the next few days, I played the part of the calm neighbor, mowing my lawn, waving politely at the mailman, and even parking my truck neatly just to avoid giving them new ammunition. Karen, however, couldn't hide her obsession. She started patrolling the street twice a day, clipboard in hand, jotting notes whenever she passed my house, sometimes stopping to snap pictures of my yard or the pile of lumber, all while pretending to be on a casual stroll. Neighbors whispered about it, some rolling their eyes at her antics, others cautiously avoiding her wrath, but I could sense the tide of public opinion beginning to shift. People who once cowered at her lectures were now questioning why she was so invested in controlling everything, and the irony of her being a renter was spreading like wildfire in quiet conversations. One afternoon, as I was unloading groceries, my next-door neighbor, a young father named Mark, leaned over the fence and whispered, "Hey, I heard what you said to the cops the other day. Is it true? She really rents from you?" I nodded, grinning, and his eyes widened with a mix of shock and delight. "Man," he said, chuckling, "you just made my whole year. She's been on us about repainting our shutters for months. If she's just a tenant, she's got no right." That was the moment I realized I wasn't fighting this war alone. Quietly, subtly, the neighborhood was starting to side with me, not because they loved me, but because they hated Karen's tyranny, and now that her throne was wobbling, they wanted to see it topple. By the end of the week, Karen escalated again. This time, it wasn't a letter, it was a summons to attend an HOA disciplinary hearing scheduled for the following Monday evening at the community center. The notice accused me of chronic noncompliance, a phrase that sounded more suited for a criminal than a homeowner, and warned that severe fines and legal action could follow if I didn't show up. I almost burst out laughing. A disciplinary hearing? Over lumber in my driveway? Over a personal truck? Theatrics, pure theatrics. But I knew Karen was stacking the deck, probably rallying the other board members to vote against me, hoping to create a spectacle that would restore her lost authority. Fine, I thought, let's give them a spectacle, but not the one they expect. I prepared my folder, polished my evidence, and even made a few quiet calls to neighbors who were fed up with her, encouraging them to attend. The day of the hearing, I walked into the community center not like a man on trial, but like a man ready to deliver a closing argument in court. Karen sat at the head of a long table flanked by George and Linda, her smug smile back in place, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of nerves when she saw how many neighbors had shown up to watch. They opened a meeting with pomp, reading off the so-called violations, their voices dripping with self-importance, and then they invited me to speak. I stood, held up the HOA bylaws, and began dismantling each accusation one by one, citing the exact clauses that proved my innocence. I explained that my truck was personal property, that temporary storage of materials was permitted, and that law enforcement had already confirmed no wrongdoing on my part. Then I paused, looked around the room, and delivered the final blow. But before we go any further, I think the board and the community deserve to know that one of your members, the very person leading this charge, does not meet the eligibility requirements to serve. According to the bylaws, only homeowners may hold board positions. Karen is not a homeowner. She is a tenant. She pays rent. To me. Gasps filled the room, heads turned toward Karen, and for the second time in as many weeks, her mask slipped, her face flushing crimson as neighbors whispered, some laughing openly. George fumbled with his papers. Linda looked like she'd swallowed a lemon, and Karen sputtered, "That's not relevant. That's private information." But it was too late. The truth was out, undeniable, and the neighbors now had confirmation of what they had only whispered about before. The board tried to regain control of the meeting, but the room was buzzing, the tide had turned, and I stood calmly watching Karen's empire crumble further. That night, as I walked back to my house under the glow of the streetlights, I knew the battle wasn't over, but I also knew I had struck a blow she might never recover from. Still, people like Karen don't fade quietly. They fight dirtier when cornered, and though she had been exposed as a fraud, I could already sense that her next move would be more desperate, more reckless, and I braced myself for whatever storm she was about to unleash. Section 3, the fallout from the HOA hearing was like a crack in a dam, and once that crack spread, the water rushed out faster than Karen could patch it, because for years she had built her reputation on fear and intimidation, on being the one who always knew the rules and always had the power to enforce them. But now that everyone knew she was just a tenant, my tenant no less, her authority evaporated, and people who once cowered at her door now ignored her warnings, smirked when she walked by, and whispered jokes about her behind their hedges. Yet instead of humbling her, the humiliation only seemed to ignite something more dangerous inside her. I could see it in the way she stalked down the street with her clipboard clenched like a weapon, in the way her eyes darted suspiciously at anyone who dared to smile in my direction, and in the way her trash cans started mysteriously tipping over at night, her mail mysteriously going missing, her lawn mysteriously accumulating weeds, as if the universe itself had turned against her. But of course, Karen wasn't going to sit quietly while the neighborhood mocked her. No, she was already plotting a comeback, and she decided to go straight for the jugular me. Within a week of the hearing, I received an envelope from a local law office, a cease and desist letter accusing me of defamation of character and unlawful disclosure of private tenancy information at the HOA meeting, demanding that I retract my statements publicly and issue a written apology to Karen within 10 days or face a lawsuit. I read it twice, then laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee, because while Karen might have convinced some bargain basement lawyer to draft the letter, the reality was that nothing I had said was false. In fact, the lease agreement she signed herself was the very evidence I had presented, and truth, as the saying goes, is an absolute defense against defamation. Still, I wasn't reckless. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, a sharp-minded woman named Alicia, who had handled my real estate portfolio for years, and within 24 hours she drafted a response that not only dismantled the claims, but also warned Karen that if she continued to misuse the legal system for harassment, we would pursue counterclaims for damages. That should have been the end of it, but Karen wasn't rational anymore. She was desperate, and desperation makes people reckless. When the legal angle failed to rattle me, she switched to sabotage. One morning I stepped outside to find nails scattered across my driveway, dozens of them glinting in the sunlight, placed there deliberately to puncture my truck's tires. I collected them carefully, bagged them as evidence, and installed new security cameras around the property, angling them toward the street and her house. A few nights later, the cameras caught her sneaking across the road in her slippers, crouching near my mailbox with something in her hands. The next morning, I found it stuffed with HOA flyers, accusing me of being a bully landlord who was trying to destroy the community. I couldn't help but admire the irony. This woman who had built her entire persona on control and secrecy was now exposed and flailing, throwing mud in every direction, hoping something would stick. The neighbors weren't buying it, though. In fact, many of them quietly approached me to express their support, like Mrs. Alvarez 2 doors down, who confided that Karen had harassed her for months about the color of her roses, or Tom, an elderly widower who said Karen had once threatened to fine him for leaving his recycling bin out past noon. They were tired, fed up, and now that they knew she had no real authority, they were rallying behind me not because they liked me particularly, but because I had stood up to her and exposed her lies. I began to realize that this wasn't just my battle anymore. It was the neighborhood's chance at liberation from her reign of pettiness. And yet, Karen didn't stop. Her next move was perhaps the most audacious yet. She tried to rally a petition to have me evicted from the neighborhood altogether, claiming that as a landlord I was exploiting the community and lowering property values by renting to undesirable tenants. The hypocrisy was staggering. She was one of those tenants, but she went door to door with George and Linda, clipboard in hand, trying to gather signatures. Most people declined, some politely, others with thinly veiled amusement, but a few of her die-hard loyalists signed, people who either feared her wrath or genuinely believed her paranoia. She managed to scrape together maybe 10 names, a pitiful fraction of the community, but she strutted around as if she had gathered a revolution, waving the papers like proof of her power. I didn't confront her directly, I didn't need to. Instead, I called a special meeting with my attorney present, invited all the homeowners, not tenants, to attend and laid out the facts with cold precision. I own 4 properties in the neighborhood, including Karen's, and each one was well maintained, occupied by responsible tenants who contributed positively to the community. I explained that as landlords and homeowners, we had every right to participate in the neighborhood, but tenants serving on the board was a direct violation of the bylaws. Then I revealed the security footage, Karen sneaking across the street with flyers, scattering nails, behaving like a petty vandal rather than a leader. The room buzzed with murmurs, some gasps, and more than a few outright laughs at the absurdity of it all. When the vote came to remove her from the board permanently, it wasn't even close. She was ousted unanimously, her name struck from the records, her clipboard stripped from her hands, metaphorically, if not literally. That should have ended it. But Karen's pride couldn't handle the public exile. That night, I saw her pacing on her porch, phone pressed to her ear, her voice carrying across the street in shrill fragments. Unfair, illegal, revenge, he can't get away with this. She was unraveling, and while part of me felt a twinge of pity, the larger part knew that people like her don't stop until they self-destruct completely. And sure enough, her next and most dangerous move came not through the HOA, not through sabotage, but through the police again. One evening as I sat down to dinner, red and blue lights flashed outside, and when I opened the door, 2 officers stood there, serious and tense. "Sir," one said, "we received a call about suspected illegal activity on this property, reports of drug use and distribution." I almost laughed in their faces, but the gravity of the situation stopped me. Karen had escalated to false criminal accusations, willing to risk felony charges just to ruin me. I invited the officers inside, showed them every corner of the house, even the renovation work in progress, all neat and permitted. They left after 20 minutes, apologetic, but not before warning me that filing false reports was itself a crime. As they drove away, I looked across the street, and sure enough, Karen was standing in her window, peeking through the blinds, her face pale and tense. She thought she could frame me, thought she could use the system to crush me, but she didn't realize she was only tightening the noose around her own neck. Because now, with police reports documenting her false calls, with footage of her vandalism, with neighbors fed up and united, I had all the ammunition I needed to end this war once and for all. And as I closed my door that night, I knew Section 3 of this battle was over and Section 4, the final reckoning, was about to begin. Section 4, by the time the false police report fiasco blew over, I realized that the war with Karen had reached a point of no return, because every move she made was not only more reckless, but also more public, and the more public it became, the more she exposed herself as the fraud and manipulator she truly was. So instead of simply playing defense and letting her sling mud at me, I decided it was time to go on the offensive, not with pettiness or sabotage like she had done, but with cold, calculated strategy that would ensure she had no footing left to stand on. The first step was documentation, and thanks to my foresight and those new security cameras, I had a growing collection of evidence, footage of her trespassing on my property, tampering with my mailbox, scattering nails across my driveway, and even yelling obscenities into her phone on her porch late at night. But more than that, I had the police reports that showed a clear pattern of false 911 calls, the HOA minutes, that recorded her being exposed as a renter, and witness accounts from neighbors who were finally emboldened to speak out against her tyranny. I gathered everything into a thick binder and handed it over to my attorney, Alicia, who smiled the kind of smile lawyers save for cases they know are airtight. We could file a harassment suit, she suggested, flipping through the pages, maybe even pursue damages for defamation and the cost of dealing with her false reports. At the very least, we can get a restraining order to stop her from contacting you directly or through the HOA. The thought of Karen being legally barred from harassing me was tempting, but I wanted more than peace. I wanted resolution, a clean break for the whole neighborhood, because I could see the fatigue in my neighbors' faces, the way they avoided her house, the way they whispered about moving just to get away from her drama, and I knew that unless I finished this properly, she would find some way to claw her way back into power. So I told Alicia to hold off, at least for the moment, because I had a bigger plan, one that would dismantle not just Karen, but the broken system that had allowed her to thrive for so long. That plan started with the HOA itself. I had always kept my distance from the board, preferring to let others handle the endless debates about paint colors and mailbox designs. But now I realized that the only way to ensure long-term peace was to take a seat at the table myself. So, with the support of several homeowners who had grown tired of Karen's antics, I put my name forward for election to the board, and the response was overwhelming. People who had never bothered to attend meetings showed up in droves just to vote for me, eager for change, eager for someone who would protect their property rights rather than nitpick them into submission. Karen, of course, tried to campaign against me, whispering lies about how I was a slumlord who would fill the neighborhood with criminals, but the hypocrisy was too glaring, especially since she was one of the very tenants renting from me. On election night, the vote wasn't even close. I won by a landslide, and in that moment, the balance of power shifted permanently. From my new seat on the board, I didn't seek revenge. Instead, I sought reform, dismantling the petty policies Karen had enforced, scaling back the absurd fines, and focusing only on rules that genuinely improved safety and property values. The neighbors loved it, and the more they supported me, the more isolated Karen became. But isolation didn't mean surrender. Even stripped of her title, even exposed as a renter, even rejected by the majority, Karen still had venom to spit. She doubled down on her smear campaign, handing out flyers that accused me of being corrupt and abusive, posting rants on community forums about how I was turning the neighborhood into a rental ghetto and glaring at me from across the street with an intensity that could cut glass. Yet, every time she lashed out, she only pushed more people away, and the final nail in her coffin came from a source she never expected: her own landlord's rights. You see, while she had spent months harassing me, sabotaging me, and trying to destroy my reputation, she had neglected something very important: her rent payments. Perhaps she was so obsessed with me that she forgot, or perhaps she thought withholding rent would somehow punish me. But by the third month of partial payments and excuses, she had given me exactly what I needed: legal grounds to evict her. Filing the eviction notice wasn't something I did lightly because I knew it would cause an uproar, but it was also the cleanest, most decisive way to end this battle. I filed the paperwork, served her the notice, and watched as the reality hit her like a thunderclap. For the first time since I had known her, Karen didn't scream, didn't posture, didn't call 911. She simply stood on her porch, clutching the paper, her face pale and trembling. She tried to fight it in court, of course, but the judge didn't buy her excuses. The lease agreement was clear, the evidence of missed payments undeniable, and when my attorney presented the binder of harassment and false reports as context, the judge's patience with her wore thin. The ruling was swift. She had 30 days to vacate the property. The news spread like wildfire through the neighborhood, and while most people kept their reactions polite in public, I saw the quiet smiles, the subtle nods of relief, the whispered conversations that carried a tone of victory. For the first time in years, the cul-de-sac felt lighter, freer, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. But Karen wasn't finished, not yet. Even as she began packing her things, she muttered threats under her breath, promising that I hadn't seen the last of her, that she would find a way to ruin me, that I would regret ever crossing her. And maybe part of me believed she'd try, because people like her don't just fade away. They linger like a bad stain. But the difference now was that she had no platform, no power, no allies left to rally behind her. She was just another tenant being evicted for failure to pay rent, and no matter how she tried to spin it, the facts were undeniable. As moving trucks pulled up to her house during those final days, neighbors gathered discreetly at their windows, watching with a mixture of relief and morbid fascination, like spectators at the end of a long, exhausting play. And I simply sat on my porch with my coffee, the same way I had the day this all began, watching her empire crumble piece by piece. I knew the war wasn't officially over, not until she was gone for good, but for the first time, I felt the finish line in sight, and as section 4 of the story closed, I prepared myself for the final act, the epilogue where Karen's shadow would no longer loom over our neighborhood. Section 5, when moving day finally arrived, it felt like the entire neighborhood exhaled at once, a collective sigh of relief that echoed down the quiet cul-de-sac, because for years Karen had been the specter that haunted every doorstep, the shrill voice that pierced every calm morning, the self-appointed monarch whose reign of petty tyranny had infected even the simplest joys of suburban life. And now she was reduced to cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly on her porch, movers carrying out the pieces of her carefully curated facade, her pristine white furniture, her rows of matching ceramic planters, her endless stacks of binders and clipboards filled with useless rules and letters she had drafted to intimidate us all. I sat on my porch sipping coffee, just as I had on the morning this saga began, and I watched with a calm detachment as the movers worked under the glare of the summer sun while Karen darted around them barking orders, her hair disheveled, her voice cracking her once perfectly painted nails chipped and ragged. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, some even daring to step outside under the pretense of watering plants or checking mail, but everyone knew they were really there to witness the fall of the Queen. To mark the day the cul-de-sac was liberated, when the truck doors finally closed and Karen climbed into her car, she paused for one last look at the street, her face twisted with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something that almost looked like sorrow, and for a fleeting moment I wondered if she realized how much of this was her own doing, how every bridge she burned, every lie she told, every ounce of authority she clung to had only tightened the noose around her neck until there was no escape. She caught my eye, her glare sharp and venomous, and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Maybe a threat, maybe a promise, maybe just the last gasp of a woman who couldn't stand to lose. But then she drove away, her car disappearing down the street, and just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was profound, filled with laughter that bubbled up in unexpected places, with neighbors greeting one another without fear of reprimand, with children playing in front yards without Karen storming out to complain about noise violations. The neighborhood transformed almost overnight. It was as if her departure had lifted a spell, and people began reclaiming their homes, repainting shutters in colors they actually liked, planting flowers that didn't conform to her ridiculous guidelines, even hosting small block parties on Friday evenings where music drifted softly through the air and laughter spilled into the street. I joined in sometimes, chatting with Mark and his kids, sharing stories with Mrs. Alvarez, watching Tom smile for the first time in years as he told jokes without fear of Karen eavesdropping and scolding him for leaving his recycling bin out too long. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. No place ever is, but it was free, and that freedom tasted sweeter than anything money could buy. For me, personally, the battle had been exhausting, draining at times, but it also reminded me of something important. Power only exists where people give it, and for years, everyone had handed Karen their power out of fear, out of habit, out of the illusion that her rules mattered more than their own peace. By standing up to her, by exposing her lies, by refusing to cower when she called the cops or spread rumors, I had given others permission to stand too, and together we had toppled the false queen of our tiny kingdom. But as satisfying as that was, the final twist came a few months later when Alicia called me with news. "You'll never believe this," she said, her tone laced with amusement. "But Karen's new landlord just reached out to me for some paperwork, and guess what? She moved into another neighborhood with an HOA. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink because of course Karen would. People like her don't change, they just relocate, carrying their drama like luggage, setting up camp in the next unsuspecting community. But the best part, the delicious cherry on top, was that Alicia had gotten a look at her new lease agreement, and it turned out the property wasn't owned by some faceless investor or distant corporation. It was owned by one of Alicia's longtime clients, a friend of mine from the real estate circles, and when he found out about Karen's history, he reached out to me personally to say, "Thanks for the heads up. Don't worry, I'll keep a close eye on her." The irony was almost poetic. Karen had fled our neighborhood thinking she could reinvent herself, regain her throne somewhere new. And yet she had unknowingly walked right back into the web of people who knew her tricks, people who wouldn't let her run unchecked again. I never saw her after that, never heard from her directly, but sometimes stories filtered back through mutual acquaintances. Rumors of her clashing with another HOA board, of her calling 911 on another neighbor over trash cans, of her slowly losing credibility as her reputation caught up with her like a shadow she could never outrun. And me? I kept building my little empire quietly, renting properties, maintaining my home, sipping coffee on my porch every morning while the cul-de-sac thrived around me. The neighborhood had found its rhythm again, not under the tyranny of one self-appointed ruler, but under the simple understanding that respect and freedom were worth more than any rulebook. Sometimes, when the breeze was just right and the laughter of kids echoed down the street, I thought back to the day Karen had called 911 on me, her smug face lit by the flashing red and blue lights, convinced she had cornered me. And I couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all, because while she had tried to paint me as the problem, as the villain, as the rule breaker, the truth was that she had been paying me rent the whole time, funding the very life she was so desperate to control. That was the final lesson Karen never learned. You can scream about rules, you can wave clipboards and call cops and rally boards, but at the end of the day, power doesn't come from paper threats or loud voices. It comes from ownership, from truth, from the quiet confidence of knowing exactly where you stand. And I stood firmly unshaken, with Karen's rent checks long deposited, with her memory fading into neighborhood legend, a cautionary tale whispered at block parties and laughed about over barbecues, the story of the woman who thought she ruled the HOA, but forgot the most important detail of all, that the crown she wore was borrowed, and it belonged to her landlord.